This is a case from England, where I'm from. David McGreevy murdered 3 children whom he was babysitting. All of the children were under the age of 5 years old. He beat one, strangled the second, and slit the throat of the third. He then impaled their bodies on a neighbour's wrought iron fence. The judge in that case recommended life with a minimum term of 20 years. McGreevy was eventually released after serving 40 years. The mother of the 3 children didn't believe that her children's murderer should ever have been released, saying that there were people who had committed far less serious offences who were never allowed to leave prison. I know that this case and the case of Ronald Sanford have their differences, but I find the comparison interesting. David McGreevy is Caucasian. He was 22 when he murdered the 3 children who he was babysitting. He was intoxicated when he committed the murders, and he went on to mutilate the bodies. He did plead guilty to the murders, as Ronald Sanford did. So Ronald Sanford pleaded guilty to the murders of 2 elderly ladies, and he was only 13 years old when the murders were committed. He is African American. Both defendants were known to the police. Out of the 2 defendants, who would you have given a second chance to? Or maybe you don't feel that second chances are deserved, but when you've got someone who's 22 years old and you've got someone who's 13 years old, it makes for an interesting question, I think. The next issue to be discussed is the issue of racism. Statistics show that children of racial and ethnic minority backgrounds are hugely overrepresented at all stages of both the juvenile and general criminal justice systems. According to Amnesty International, the disproportion is worst for Black people, who make up only 15% of the population aged between 10 and 17, but they account for approximately 30% of the youth arrested, 40% of the youth held in custody in juvenile facilities, and 50% of all cases transferred by juvenile courts for trial in adult criminal courts. Sadly, but unsurprisingly, the estimated rate at which Black youth receive life without parole sentences is 10 times greater than the rate for white youth. Racial discrimination in the criminal justice system, including law enforcement, would account for this overrepresentation. Here are some other startling statistics uncovered by the Sentencing Project in 2012. Following a survey taken by people sentenced to life in prison as juveniles, it was found that 79% witnessed violence in their homes regularly. Fewer than half were attending school at the time they committed their offence. 47% were physically abused, like Ronald Sanford, and 77% of girls surveyed reported histories of sexual abuse. So at the start of the 1980s, the US went from rarely sentencing children to life without parole, but over that decade, the use of this punishment increased. Why? Was it as a response to the increase in crime rates? Well, no research has actually ever proven that the use of this extreme punishment deters juveniles from committing crimes. What it does show is that juveniles are unlikely to appreciate the reality and significance of what life without parole actually means. It suggested that the increase in the use of life without parole was largely political. An individual was more favourable politically if they took a strong stance against crime by implementing tougher laws and by increasing the length of prison sentences. Dr. William F. Schultz said the following, quote, "Untie the hands of state and federal judges and prosecutors. Give them options other than turning the courts into assembly lines that mass produce life without parole sentences for children, that ignore their enormous potential for change and rob them of all hopes for redemption." Did you know that in 11 out of the 17 years between 1985 and 2001, youth convicted of murder in the United States were more likely to enter prison with a life without parole sentence than adult murder offenders. So where are they now? Starting with Sean Lamont Rowe, Ronald Sanford's co-defendant, he served 2 years and 2 days of his almost 6-year sentence and was released on the 24th of March 1991. On the 29th of October 1999, Rowe was sentenced to 20 years for child molestation and 545 days for incest. He is currently incarcerated and is classed as a sexually violent predator. With regards to Ronald Sanford, at his guilty plea hearing, the trial court informed him that he was waiving his right to appeal his convictions, but not his right to post-conviction relief. The trial court failed to advise Sanford that he had a right to appeal his sentence. Between February 1991 and November 1995, Sanford filed 4 requests for trial court transcripts. All his requests were denied without explanation. He also filed 2 requests for transcripts with the juvenile court, which were also denied. Sanford didn't know what to do and so stopped filing motions. It was later explained to him that most courts would not give him a copy of his transcripts unless there was a petition for post-conviction relief pending. In July 2006, Sanford filed the petition and requested the transcripts. In September 2006, the trial court granted Sanford's motions for transcripts and scheduled a hearing. In January 2007, Sanford moved to reschedule the hearing because he hadn't received the transcripts. His motion was granted. The transcripts were not sent to Sanford, causing considerable delays. In May 2015, the trial court issued a written order with factual findings denying Sanford's petition for permission to file a belated appeal. Ronald Sanford is currently incarcerated at the Indiana State Prison, and as it currently stands, his earliest possible release date is the 17th of December 2070, as the judge ruled his sentences would be served consecutively. He has served his full sentence for the first murder, the sentence for which ended on the 3rd of February 2010. He is currently serving his sentence for the second murder, which ends on the 16th of December 2035. He then has to serve his sentence for the robbery charge until 2060, when he will then serve the final 10 years for the burglary charge. Many petitions have been created demanding that Sanford's case be looked into as a miscarriage of justice. Advocates for Ronald Sanford find it incomprehensible that the younger of the 2 boys would be solely responsible for wielding the knife that killed the 2 ladies, particularly as Sean Rowe was the one who walked away with the money. Rowe's evidence, which he gave in a rush to protect himself when he was arrested by the police, provided the majority of the evidence against Ronald Sanford. Sean Rowe walked away with a sentence just shy of 6 years and was released after serving just over 2 years, whereas Ronald Sanford will not be eligible for parole until he's almost 100 years old. Sanford's supporters believe that in any event, he has repaid his debt to society. He's now 46 years old and has served 33 of those years in prison. Because of the age at which he was incarcerated, Sanford has never driven a car, owned a house, travelled abroad, or even been to prom. In an interview, Sanford was grateful to have found father figures in prison who guided and protected him. In an interview with Trevor McDonald, a very articulate Sanford explained that he had used his time in prison to expand his knowledge through reading. In his cell, there were books on eugenics and metaphysics, allowing him to mentally escape his cell for a short while. What do you think? Do you think an individual who murdered 2 pensioners deserves a second chance? Does your answer change when you take into account that he was just 13 years old, the younger of the 2 boys tied to the crime? And what about Ronald Sanford's background, a young black boy who grew up without a father figure and an alcoholic mother? How might his sentence have been different if he was Caucasian? Should Ronald Sanford get a second chance at life while he is still relatively young, like David McGreevy? Tweet me with your thoughts at Student Verdict, because it genuinely interests me to see what people think. That concludes today's episode on the case of Ronald Lee Sanford. I'll put links to the petitions in the show notes so that you can have a look at them and sign them if you'd like to. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you on the next one. Remember to keep living the dream.